everybody, and thank you so much for joining me for today's fireside chat with Jenna Fisher, discussing her book, To the Top: How Women in Corporate Leadership Are Rewriting the Rules for Success. Let me start by introducing Jenna. So Jenna is a leadership expert and senior partner at Russell Reynolds Associates, a top global recruiting firm. And Jenna has been helping women navigate the upper echelons of American business for more than 20 years. Her book, which hit the bookstores in May, challenges companies to close the gender gap in their executive and board ranks. With compelling case studies of women who've succeeded in the C-suite, social science evidence, and her own experience garnered from climbing the corporate ranks, To the Top provides both the inspiration and a playbook for how we can all create meaningful change in our world. By way of background, Jenna received her MBA at the Wharton School of Business. She attended Duke Law School and Rice University. She grew up in the suburbs of Boston and is married and has a 16-year-old son and a 12-year-old daughter and two very highly energetic poodles. So Jenna, congratulations on an extraordinary first half of your career, and thank you so much for being here with us today during this wonderful time for you. It's a really delight and a privilege to welcome you today.
Thank you so much for having me, Helen, and I really appreciate the invitation by Google and Alphabet to be here today.
Absolutely. Well, I read your book, To the Top, and I absolutely loved it. There were so many insightful and practical lessons, and I encourage everybody here to buy a copy and read it if you haven't already done so. There are a multitude of amazing career and life lessons. So I'm going to kick us off with a few questions, and then at the end, for the last 15 minutes or so, I'd love to open it up to the audience and invite you to post your questions. But let's get started. So I'd love to hear, first of all, what was your inspiration for writing the book? Have you always wanted to write a book? What really drove you?
Well, I have always been an avid writer since I learned how when I was 4. But equally, I've always had a passion for keeping women on a path to professional success, which really for me started back in college when I was a sociology major. I wrote my honors thesis on the differential in performance between boys and girls in math and science. And interestingly, what I learned in that research is that the only statistically significant difference, which starts at the age of 9 for girls, was around levels of self-confidence. There was actually no discrepancy in terms of achievement. And so with that in mind, fast forward a decade to when I first started working here at Russell Reynolds as an executive recruiter. And I would hear all the time, I'm the only woman, only one, from so many women that I interviewed. And so I started convening groups of women board members and CFOs and other executives. And that followership grew over time. And then simultaneously, I also had the experience countless times where I would be introduced to just a phenomenal woman who had stellar academic credentials, who had worked in a super hot company, led an IPO, whatever it might be. But then she dropped out of the workforce after the birth of her second or third child, and then wanted to get back in at some point. And I saw how nearly impossible it was for these women to rejoin the ranks of the working in a financially meaningful way after having been out of the workforce. And this led me to thinking that there had to be a better way of keeping women with a toe, if not a foot or more, in the world of work. Because I've always believed that until women are financially on par with men, there really will be no true equality. And then COVID hit. And two things happened. First of all of a sudden I had 2 extra hours in my day that I wasn't commuting, which was such a gift. And secondarily, I realized pretty early on into the pandemic that we were living through the greatest change to how we work since the Industrial Revolution. And although at first it was somewhat pernicious for women, particularly taking care of children on the home front, I came to see it pretty quickly as something that could be turned around and used as a real positive to help garner more equality between the genders. And so I'd had this idea maybe 7 or 8 years ago for the book. So I had written maybe 20 pages back then. So I sort of dusted it off and spent from February until October of last year writing the book. And it came out, as you said, just a few months ago.
And I think in the title, you've got Rewriting the Rules. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you're thinking about that and what that means to you?
Yeah, well, I think, as I've seen leadership evolve over the last 20 years that I've been recruiting C-suite and board members, I think things are different. You know, earlier in my career, so you can probably tell from my shirt, I love the color pink. It's on the cover of my book. It's kind of everywhere in my office as I'm looking around. Pink,
Beautiful color.
beautiful color, makes me happy. And I had a senior colleague when I was pretty young in my career pull me aside. He meant it as very helpful advice, but he said, you know, if you want to get ahead, you really shouldn't wear so much pink because, you know, we need to be chameleons, and it would be great if you could just be a little more toned down, like, you know, wear white or black or navy. That would be much more appropriate. And I was sort of shocked by that because I thought, wait a minute, I'm a top decile performer in the firm, more than hitting my KPIs, doing great work. Why does it matter if I'm wearing a pink sweater or a yellow sweater or a blue sweater? But what I realized in writing my book, that it's all too common. And any woman who's tried to climb the ranks at work will at one time or another be given advice on how she needs to act differently if she wants to make it to the top. Like, don't show too much emotion. Don't be too assertive. Don't be vulnerable. Don't talk about your family. Wear some makeup, but don't wear too much makeup. Be nice, but don't be too nice. Don't laugh so much. One of the women I interviewed told me that her CEO had told her, you know, I really would appreciate if you wouldn't smile so much in board meetings because your smile is so pretty, it distracts me. And I thought, and this was like 5 years ago, you know, we're not talking about like the 1800s here. And I think the list of rules has really bordered on the absurd. And when I talk about rewriting the rules, you know, I loved Lean In, and I know there were criticisms of it, but I found many things in it when it came out that were so beneficial. But you know, ultimately, the reason that women are not on par with men financially is not that we're not leaning in enough. It's because we're trying to climb a corporate ladder that was not built for us to climb. And so I really think it's the narrative that needs to change, not the women.
I couldn't agree more. And some of the stories that you're already describing very much resonate with some of the helpful advice that I've certainly been given throughout my career.
I'm sure. Maybe you should write a book, Helen.
Maybe one day I will. So in the book, you mention that gone are the days of the hero CEO, and that a new sort of trait of successful CEOs is actually compassionate command. And I really love that phrasing. So, but can you share a little bit more about your thoughts on sort of evolving leadership in the C-suite? And what do you think are the most critical leadership traits that companies are now looking for? And how have these evolved in a changing world?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think it used to be thought that the more traditionally male, and I'm putting that in air quotes, forms of leadership, like being disruptive, being risk taking, heroic, galvanizing, all of these were really the hallmarks of a great leader. That and, you know, probably being 6 feet, 3 inches tall. But what we've come to learn through our research here at Russell Reynolds is that actually what is most dispositive and predictive of success is not just leaders who, yes, those traits can be very important depending upon the context, but equally important is the ability to demonstrate seemingly oppositional kinds of leadership. So being connecting, vulnerable, more reluctant at times, more pragmatic at times, quieter, more introverted forms of leadership. It's that ability to toggle back and forth between those two ends of the spectrum that actually is most predictive of success. And I think we saw this in droves with COVID, both on a public level as well as a private level, with a real need to lead with connectedness, empathy, kindness. I think women can shine as leaders in those arenas as well at a global scale. And I should also point out that we did the research at the beginning of the book. I called the head of data science at Hogan, where we have an exclusive partnership, who they're generally thought to be the preeminent executive assessment tool. And so I called them and I said, hey, you know, I'd love it if your teams could look at all of the statistically significant ways in which men and women differ from each other at work, because I'm going to use that in interviewing the women for my book to learn more. And I kept having a monthly update with the team to find out what were the differences. And it turns out the differences were non-existent. There actually are no statistically significant differences between men and women in terms of how they show up at work. And so I thought, well, that's a really important data point, because it means women have everything it takes to be successful, coupled with the fact that we're graduating more than men from undergrad, more than men from graduate school. 71% of high school valedictorians are women. So I think we have never had the stage set quite as well as we have today for women to ascend into C-suite leadership roles.
Can you talk more about how sort of perceptions of leadership have been shifting? So you mentioned the impact of COVID for sure required differences in how we show up, but this is actually an evolving trend that you've seen over quite some time now.
Yeah. Well, I definitely think that we have seen differences over time. And one of the things that I was really encouraged by in my book was that the women who were successful by being who they are, not by what people expect them to be. And I think there was a period of time when women were so underrepresented in the upper echelons of business that they felt really compelled to suppress certain traits.
Yeah.
But now we know that it's time to not just demonstrate, but also embrace qualities like vulnerability, authenticity, compassion. We have found that the leaders who were most successful were ones who felt free to talk about their life, share what's going on with their families. And one of the amazing women I interviewed in my book was a woman, Dame Vivian Hunt, who formerly was the vice chair of McKinsey in London. She's now the chief innovation officer at United Healthcare. And one of the things she shared with me in my interview was that earlier in her career, she had a preconceived notion of how she was supposed to show up, what she was supposed to say, what she was supposed to do. And she didn't let her full authentic self come through. But as she got to be a bit more senior, and she realized through 360 feedback from her team that people weren't really getting to know her as a total person, she then gathered the confidence to let down her mask, is how she talked about it, to let her full personality shine through. She joked, she said, I thought if I let them know who I am, worst case scenario, if they fired me, I could find another job. So I thought it was pretty de-risked. But it turns out that that was the exact moment that her career took off, because people don't want to work for a robot. They want to work for a real human being who can empathize with what they might be going through. And we've really seen this migration happen. And I'm personally just so thrilled about it, because I think it means, when I think about the kind of energy that we all, especially folks at Google Alphabet, I mean, you guys work hard, and to do your best work, you really need to bring so much energy to your job. I mean, sometimes I think, God, what we do is like magical on a day-to-day basis. And if any part, even if only 10% of your energy is focused on being somebody who you're not, then I just don't think you're going to ever be your optimal self, assuming you're in the right environment. And so I think it's a really important lesson for all of us, men and women.
Oh my goodness, I couldn't agree more. That resonates so deeply. Like the expectations of like the bounds of expected and acceptable behaviors are so narrow. And so we almost like straitjacket ourselves to a certain expectation of what leadership is. And then you suddenly realize that that actually doesn't serve you. It doesn't serve the people around you. I couldn't agree more that actually letting your guard down can be a very hard thing to do, but it's absolutely necessary.
Yeah. And I think the other thing to keep in mind is that, and this, it's funny, when I had gone into writing the book with all kinds of hypotheses about what was going to be most salient. And many of the things that I thought were proven to be true, but there were other things that I hadn't even conceived of or thought of that bubbled up in my interviews. And one of them is that, this world that we're all kind of working in has been largely a vestige from the industrial era that, evolved 100 years ago, modeled after the assembly line. It was created at a time when managers had to physically see their teams to ensure work was being done. And we didn't have the myriad means of communicating and collaborating electronically, thanks to companies like Google, that we do today. And I think that it means we really need to rethink how we measure outputs and not inputs on what people are doing. And it used to be, I mean, I remember the days that you all knew somebody who came in at 7 in the morning and didn't leave till 10 at night. And you'd say, oh, that Bob, he's killing it. He's crushing it. And who knows if Bob was actually doing anything productive all day? We didn't know. But now we can look at somebody's technological footprint to see what they're contributing and what value they're adding. And, clearly there are new muscles to be developed and new skills to be learned. But I think that there is an egalitarianism in this new world order that I'm really super positive about, because it means everybody's box is the same size. It doesn't matter if you're tall or you're short, you're sitting at the front of the boardroom or on the side of the room, if you're loud or quiet, what your color is, what your sexual orientation is, what your gender is. But everybody has an equal opportunity to speak up. And I think that's really good news for women.
Yes, I completely agree. And that's actually reminding me of one of the stories in the book. Maybe you can share about leaving loud.
Oh, yeah. Oh, she was great. So Sarah Mensah, who's the GM of the Nike brand at Nike, who's a total superstar, she does this thing where whenever she has to go somewhere for work that is for, her son, for example, take him to a doctor's appointment or a soccer game, she goes around to all of her teammates and she says, hey, just so you know, I'm going to be, tied up for the next hour or so. Call me if you need me. She lets everybody know where she's going and why. And it sounds like such a simple thing, and it is a simple thing. It costs nothing. And yet, I think all of a sudden it just gives people a little bit of like room to breathe, to think, oh, I too can have a life outside of work, and I don't need to pretend that doesn't exist. It's okay to let that bleed into my professional life. As long as I'm delivering on my job, like, that's very relatable. And I think it's really important too, because, one of the things that's been so heartening for me, Helen, in this whole book launch and tour is the number of men who have come up to me to say, what can I do to help? And men are such important allies. When you think about 91% of CEOs are men, not that you need your sponsor to be a CEO, but certainly men have a huge role to play, and men really want to help. And this is one small way, just by showing a little bit of your personal life and helping to build that trust and empathy with your team. I think it really frees people up to feel like they don't need to be somebody they're not. So I loved Sarah's comment about leaving loud.
Yes, I really liked it too. And I've definitely been putting it into practice as well. Much
Awesome.
more.
I'm
So
so delighted to hear that.
I appreciate the tip. I wanted to get back to something that you said earlier in the conversation, just about women stepping out of the workforce. And there was a great quote from one of the women that you interviewed, I think it was Amy Bunsell, who said, you shouldn't have to sprint every mile of your career. Sometimes it's okay to just walk for a bit. And so I'd love to hear your reflections on this advice in the context of sometimes it can be difficult to get back in. And, I'm sure there are a number of women listening in on this call and navigating their careers, and they have mentors and sponsors also on this call that are thinking about how they can support. So I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, well, if you look carefully at the cover of my book, there's sort of a stylized web design on the front. And I think we need to start thinking about careers as webs and not ladders. I think, again, one of the sort of no duh moments, I guess, that I had at the end, but it never occurred to me before, is that what we all have viewed as a successful career arc of, learn in your 20s, start to earn in your 30s. You really need to hit the apex of your career by, 45 to 50. If you're not there by then, you're never going to get there. And then, get out at 55 or retire. That has all been predicated on what worked for men over the course of time. And it's not that men are trying to harm women, far from it. It's just that the system wasn't set up with us in mind. And especially for women who want to have children, which not everybody does. But if you look at the data, it is the moment in time that women have children that their earnings start to diverge from those of men. Up until that point, there actually are no statistically significant differences between the genders. But the reality is there's still, as far as I last checked, the biological imperative for women who want to have kids, that they're most likely the one getting pregnant. They're the one staying pregnant, dealing with the physicality and indignities of that, giving birth, breastfeeding, not to mention that, unfortunately, the amount of childcare that most couples divide up is still not equal, with the woman doing far more of it in many homes, although I know that's thankfully changing. And so maybe as a result of all that, as Amy Bunzel, the EVP of technology at Autodesk, said, we shouldn't expect every single woman, and by the way, this would also apply to men who want to have an active role in their children's lives, to be assiduously climbing the career ladder day in and day out. And maybe it's okay if it takes her a year or two longer to get to that next inflection point or promotion cycle. And, I also think one of the other takeaways I will mention that I hadn't thought about before writing my book, but became crystal clear to me, is that we as a country and society need to also find a way of getting men to be able to and feeling the freedom to take paternity leave. We're the only developed country in the world here in the US without a paternity policy. And there are lots of reasons why people may need personal leave to take care of elderly parents, what have you. And I think we just need to find a way in our companies of creating the space for both men and women to lead full lives while also contributing meaningfully at work.
Yeah, I have friends in Sweden, and it's an incredible policy there where it's basically a year and it can be divided between both parents. So each one can split it 6 months each or however they want to divide it. So
yes, and it's even one better than that, because if both people don't take it, you lose the other half. And the woman is not allowed to take the full 12 months.
oh
So I think the
wow, I
most a
didn't
woman can
realize.
take is 9 months. So that means if the man doesn't take it, then they lose the 3 months. So yeah, and I mean, it's interesting. The Nordics are a really interesting case study because they do have so many progressive policies. There are still issues there though, because there labor is so expensive. Many people cannot afford daycare, or there's public daycare, but I mean, nannies and that sort of thing are almost unheard of. Plus, there's a culture of like you do it yourself. And a lot of the public daycares close at 3:30 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So it is still, I've spoken to many women there. A lot of women still feel the pressure to be the one to go get the child from. So there's work to be done everywhere. That's the good news. There's opportunity for improvement. But certainly that their paternity policy is far better than the United States, which has none. So
And then before we move in, just move on from this topic, just one other question I had is, one of the things you talk about in the book is not leaving completely and making sure that you keep a toe in the workforce for people that do need to take a step back. So do you have like example? I'd love to hear your reflections on that point, and just even examples you have of like ways in which people still stay engaged.
yeah. Well, I think networking is a big part of that. And again, going back to, for heterosexual couples, on average, the woman is 2.5 years younger than the husband. And so it might stand to reason that at the point in time they have children, they look at their wages and they say, oh, you woman are making half of what I, man, am making. So, why don't you just, take your maternity leave and go with it? And again, it's nobody, I don't think, trying to harm women, but it speaks nothing to potentiality. And I think there are lots of things like that systemically that we really need to rethink to support women so they can develop their careers before they get snuffed out too soon. And I think another, I say mistake, if you will, that some women make, and my book is not about fixing women, but one of the things that I did hear loud and clear is that lots of women, once they have a child, they think, okay, I'm gonna solve for the two most important things. I'm going to one, do a great job at my job every day and totally kick butt, and then I'm going to hurry home and I'm going to focus on my family and being a great mom and parent. And that makes logical sense on some level. But the problem is when you compound that month after month, year after year, and Jennifer Goldfarb, the CEO and founder of Ipsy, in the book who I interviewed, talked about this. She got to a point in her career where she felt underpaid. She wasn't as engaged in what she was doing, but she felt kind of stuck because she was like, well, all I've been doing is working at this job in this company. Nobody outside really knows me, and being a mom, which is so important to me. But how do I go about making a change? And so I'm sort of taking Jen's advice. I've renamed it. She had it called the once a month rule. I call it take yourself on a date once a month, where you invest in yourself and you think, okay, once a month, I'm going to do some sort of networking activity. And I know networking gets kind of a pejorative view by some, but it's not about standing awkwardly in a hotel ballroom handing out your business card. It's really about engaging with people who might be a standard deviation or two away from your day job and the core of your network, to think about how can you help them, right? If you put yourself out there to help other people and be a connector, that sort of reciprocity will only come back to benefit you. And so I've found this time and time again with women. There's the one, sort of extreme example you cite in terms of just leaving altogether, but, and thinking about how do you keep a toe in the water? How do you keep networking even when you're super busy? I had a woman recently who, for all intents and purposes, should absolutely be on a public company board. She's a total rock star. And yet she has really no visibility outside of her very large company. And so I think, and I started connecting her with other board members because, again, she should be on a board. But you really need to think about how you can get outside of your initial world to get and you can use other people in your network to say, oh, you know what, this is a person who looks like me, professionally, not literally, and but they're maybe 10 years my senior or 5 years my senior. I want to better understand how they got to where they are. You orthogonal person who's connected to both of us, could you connect us, because I'd love to learn. And most people are more than happy to help bestow wisdom.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. It can feel like it can take a lot of effort, but I agree. It's so critical for every single one of us to continue to build relationships in all directions. And you never know how it's going to come back to help you or the other person over time.
Yeah.
So.
And especially for introverts, I've been told, I'm not one, but I'm married to one. So it can feel like you're asking for a favor or feel like you're sort of hassling the person. But I think it's really important. I mean, everybody watching this is a highly intelligent and very accomplished individual. And I think it's really important to know that you have a skill set actually that other people very well may need and want. And there is a dearth of talent. And so I think it's really important that everybody feel self-confident enough to put themselves out there, because you might be doing somebody a favor and that somebody might be you.
For sure. I wanted to touch on something that you mentioned earlier. You talked about the fact that as time has evolved, women have experienced this double blind of like not being perceived as too emotional on one end of the spectrum, not wanting to be perceived as too aggressive on the other end of the spectrum. But it can take a lot to tap into your own authenticity. So I'm just curious, like, what's your journey been like, and how have you over time develop the bravery, the comfort, whatever you want to call it, to really tap into your own authenticity?
Yeah, well, I mean, I was very fortunate. I mean, I would say most people probably don't wake up when they're 20 years old and have some epiphany about what they want to be when they grow up. And I was no different from that. I had many different journeys before I landed on search. I thought I wanted to go to academia. Then I went to law school. Then I worked in management consulting at Bain. And then I went to business school. And it wasn't until I'd had all of those various experiences that it was funny. It was when I was writing my business school letter or application. I had a partner at Bain who was writing one of my letters of recommendation. And he took me into his office. He said, okay, what's our angle? What's your shtick? I need to know. And what do you want to do after business school? And I thought, well, I really like management consulting. I like the diversity of clients. I love my colleagues. So maybe I'll just come back here and become a partner. And he sort of looked at me quizzically and he said, I don't see that. And I was sort of taken aback. I was, what do you mean you don't see that? Like, and he said, well, there are three things we're evaluated on here. There's the client piece, there's the team piece, and the value add. Value add in Bain lingo is code for quant. And, I was a sociology major, had gone to law school. So like Excel was not my love language going into the job. And he said, you're amazing with clients. Like, you're better than most of our partners here. You're incredible with the team. Everybody loves working with you. But, really the value add is the most important part here. And you're just average. And it was like, I remember in that moment, I was like, okay, don't cry, don't cry. I think the last time I was told I was average was like 7th grade softball. So I was sort of like, oh man. And, so I kind of ruminated on that and digested and came back to him a few days later. And I was like, okay, you're not wrong. Like, this isn't what I love. Like, there are certain aspects of the job I love, but probably the biggest part of it wasn't what I got out of bed in the morning to do. And I was sort of like, what does that mean? And so it kind of set me on this path where I just spent maybe the next year talking to people, thinking about like, what am I already really good at naturally? And if I can align that with a profession and work really hard, I could go from being, top decile or top quartile, whatever, to the best in the world at it. And it was really liberating for me. And it did take bravery, I will say, because although I had never picked anything specifically to be impressive to other people, most of the things I had done looked good on paper. If you were to find like a top 10 list somewhere of like, professions that people think are admirable or prestigious, law, management, consulting might be on that list. I I'm guessing executive search. It would not be. Most people don't even know what that is. And I remember being at Thanksgiving at my aunt's house that year after I'd gotten into business school and was telling my family, oh, this is what my extended relatives, this is what I'm going to do after business school. And I remember my aunt saying to me, wait a minute, so you mean to say you've gone to all these fancy schools and you're going to be a headhunter? And I thought, well, yeah, we don't call it that, but yeah, and I'm really excited about it. And I think, for me, it was so liberating just to find that thing that I was really excited about and not really care what other people thought. And so I think, when people ask me the question, like, what do you think we can do for our children to help them maximize their potential in life? I do think finding your passion. And I think sometimes passion, people think that means like, oh, I have to be so good at it. And if I don't have to work hard, then it can't be my passion. No, like your passion is just something that your aptitude is naturally higher around. It doesn't mean you're still not going to have setbacks and you're still not going to have to work really, really hard. But I think it's really important to expose kids to lots of things so they can figure out what that might be. And it's not just a top 10 list somewhere.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Other people, I'm sure, have played a critical role in helping you throughout your career. I think we should all be intentional about surrounding ourselves with cheerleaders. So I'd love to hear, who've been your cheerleaders throughout your career and what has been the impact of their support on you?
Yeah. Well, I think this is one area, where I talk in the book about mentorship and sponsorship. And I think for lots of women, we might naturally have mentors. And let me delineate between the two for a moment. So a mentor is somebody who you admire, somebody you want to sort of be like on some level, you want to emulate. And I think a lot of women have had great mentors in both women and men. But I would argue that sponsors are actually even more important. So a sponsor is somebody who will create opportunities for you. They have influence in the organization that you're in, and they're going to talk you up when you're not in the room. They're going to give you great, challenging work assignments that will stretch you, but you're going to work your tush off and deliver. And then the reciprocity is that they will then speak very highly of you. And I was really fortunate to have a few influential sponsors. It's funny, I look back and I don't think there was any sort of, I don't know if I just got lucky. I don't remember if I don't know that I was so planful around it. It just sort of happened. But I think people could certainly be planful around it and think about who are the people that I really want to impress and get to know me in this organization. And it doesn't have to be the most senior person. It just has to be people maybe a level above you. And I was really fortunate to know those people and, to learn from them. And it was not about friendship. It was not about like hanging out outside of work. They weren't people I necessarily wanted to be, other than I really admired their intellect and their work product. But they were people who I worked hard for. And in turn, they created amazing opportunities for me. And so I do think that is something that women need to think about. And it's also important to remember that a lot of the sponsors will be men.
That is for sure. And what you just described, it was mostly within the context of your organization. You must have like sponsors, cheerleaders from outside as well. So I'd also love to hear about your engagement with people much more broadly within your network and how they've really helped you.
Yeah. Well, I've been really fortunate in the work I do. Again, it was not Machiavellian on my part. It just was something I enjoyed doing. But earlier in my career, as I mentioned, I started connecting people and bringing them together. And that was kind of my value add. And I became seen as the epicenter of these managed networks. And that really was super reinforcing and beneficial for me, because then I got to sort of learn from and benefit from their extended networks. And so, everybody has a different way of being. Not everybody is naturally the connector. So I'm not saying you have to do that specifically, but I do think the more we put ourselves out and extend ourselves to be helpful to other people, there is a benefit that comes back to you. And so, do it because you enjoy it, or do it because it's the right thing to do. And ultimately, I think the benefit will inure back to you.
Yeah, for sure.
But I'd also add, just talking about cheerleaders, I mean, I would be very negligent to not mention my husband in that, because I do think that arguably I mean, for me anyway, the most important decision I ever made in life was my partner that I picked for life. And thankfully, his mother is a huge feminist, and she taught him how to make his bed and get his lunch and do his laundry and all that when he was, in third grade. And I don't know that I would be as successful as I am if I didn't have a partner who was very capable of, doing 50-50 on the home front with me, and didn't need me to be his mother as well. So, to younger people out there, be very careful and thoughtful about the person if you decide to get married, be really thoughtful about that.
I hope he gets to hear your reflections on him at some point. Obviously,
he knows.
Yeah, and
we have our 20-year anniversary.
My husband is definitely my number one cheerleader. So
yeah, him and my mom. My mom is still a big cheerleader, and I was very thankful and lucky to have such an amazing woman ahead of her time as well.
That's wonderful. So you spoke to 50 incredible women around the world, senior leaders who've made their way up. I'd love to hear, maybe you can share, one or two stories of things that maybe surprised you. I'm sure you had a bunch of hypotheses maybe going into some of these conversations, but can you tell us about one or two things that really shifted how you're thinking or just gave you a surprise?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that, and this wasn't a woman I interviewed, but kind of a funny story, that when I was in the midst of writing my book, actually, I'm gonna tell a different story. This is a woman that when I was about to finish writing my book, I had to pop down to LA for a client meeting for the day, and I was on the plane. It was early. It was like a 6 a.m. flight, and a woman greeted me at the door to the aircraft, and I thought she was a flight attendant. I sat down, I took my seat, and then, fast forward half an hour or whatever, I see her go into the cockpit, and I hear her come on, and she's the pilot. And I thought, oh my gosh, Jenna, here you are writing a book about gender equality. And I assumed erroneously that this woman was the flight attendant and not the pilot. And I will never make that mistake again, mind you. But it was such a good reminder to me that we all have unconscious bias. I'm certainly not perfect. This is a topic near and dear to my heart, clearly. And even I had biases. And that really stuck with me, because I thought, you know what, we all need to examine the unconscious bias that we might have. And unless we admit it, people who say they're colorblind or, all that sort of stuff, it's kind of like, well, really, I think we all need to look at ourselves really hard in the mirror. And then we need to question our definitions of what great leadership looks like. I've heard so many times from people, oh, I don't think she's the right person for the role. She doesn't have enough gravitas. Well, what does that mean exactly? Like, is that really a fair criticism, or is she just not tall enough to meet your expectations? I remember early on, I think I mentioned this in the book, when I first started in search, one of the senior partners said to me, oh, go look at the candidate letters that this other older gentleman wrote. And candidate letters are these sort of 2 to 3 page letters we write to our clients that summarize a candidate's background and their fit against and for the position specification. We send them before every interview that our candidates have with clients. And I remember looking at this one, and it literally started as, he walks in from central casting, standing 6 feet 4 inches tall with a full head of sandy blonde hair. Tom loves taking long walks on the beach with his wife of 30 years, Nancy. And it went on, and I was like, how is this relevant to his ability to do the job? Like, it was so, that would not happen today, mind you. But it just really speaks to what I think we need to do, and, one of the women I interviewed, Krista Quarles, who's currently the CEO of Aludo, she'd been the CEO of OpenTable. When she got there, she saw only 14% of engineers were women. And she thought, well, that's weird. Like, there are way more women engineers out there. And so they started blinding resumes. Within 1 quarter, literally within 3 months, they had started hiring over 50% of new engineering hires for women by doing that one thing. And we all know, the Harvard University Orchestra study, I think many of us are familiar with, where they wanted to infuse more diversity into their orchestra, their symphony. And so they started closing the curtains and having people walk on stage without shoes. So you couldn't tell if it was high heels or regular shoes. And all of a sudden, the number of women that got hired went up over 50%. just by doing that one thing. And I think there are all these little small things that our companies can do. Most of them don't even cost anything. And if we did them all together, I think it would really be a powerful way of removing these systemic biases that we have.
Actually, just on that point, especially since you're in the human capital industry, like how have you already made adjustments in how you engage with your clients to put forth like resumes or people that in a gender blind way, or trying to remove certain things from the profile that could unintentionally trigger unconscious biases? I'd love to hear what you've been doing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there are many things, and I enumerate probably over a dozen of these in the book. But I think one of the ways that we've been really seeing this in action at Russell Reynolds is with regard to succession planning. So, most companies will say, yeah, I want more diversity. I want more women. I want more people of color. Like, it's a desirable thing. We all have read the articles that, more diversity yields better financial outcomes and more profitability. And yet, I see a lot of companies get to the point where they're sort of like, oh, well, there's nobody in the pipeline, or there aren't the people ready. And so what we're seeing is much more planfulness on the parts of companies where they're saying 3 years, you're right when a CEO starts, or right when a new C-suite individual starts, they'll say, okay, let's start thinking about the next generation behind this individual. Let's assess all of those people. Let's figure out what their leadership gaps are. Let's figure out what stretch opportunities they need, so that, we're constantly updating this every 6 months, so that, fast forward 3 years, when that CXO steps down or moves to a new company or whatever happens, all of a sudden we have people who not just could do the job, but they've been tested, they've been moved into somewhat orthogonal roles to sort of test their strategic thinking and ability to respond to more challenging and different kinds of issues on the business. And I think that is really starting to pay dividends. I mean, we saw last year the highest percentage of internal promotions of women CFOs, for example, that we've ever seen. And that was in large part because companies are getting religion around succession planning. And so there are a myriad ways that companies can do this, but I think that's one that I'm really heartened to see so much energy going against.
That is really good to hear. Now, you've obviously spent time with so many extraordinary people around the world, not least in your interviews, and I'm sure you've been given career advice that's really stuck with you. So I'd love to hear, like, what was the most helpful piece of career advice that you've been given, but then also passing it forward. I'm sure there are plenty of men and women that have come to you for advice, and I'd be curious to hear, like, what's the one thing that you find you repeat most often when you're actually sharing career advice with people that are asking you for it?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I personally really benefited from was, and again, I think about this in the context of when people ask, how can I set my children up or younger people in my life up for success? I think it's really important that we think about financial planning. And I talk about this a little bit in the book. T. Cole, who's the president of Citi, who I interviewed, she was really fortunate to, like I was, be raised by parents that really kind of drilled it into her head from a young age. You need to be financially independent. And I think so often, especially for women, maybe don't tell them like, hey, you need to be able to rely on yourself. And I know I've seen many unfortunate stories over the course of my career where women have come in where they had to come back to work because their spouse passed away or left them or whatever. And they all of a sudden were in this financially very stressful situation. And so that's why, to your earlier point, keeping a toe in the world of work, not to be at all pessimistic, and there are lots of great reasons to work, to feel engaged and invigorated, but equally there's a pragmatism there. And I think we need to be perhaps talking to children more about this. And I remember earlier in my career, maybe in high school, I took a quiz. It was probably one step above a Cosmo quiz, but it was administered in my school. And it was sort of, what should you be when you grow up kind of thing. And all of the options, all really honorable and wonderful professions. But I remember thinking, oh my gosh, if I do any of those jobs, like I will essentially be like living at the poverty line. And I knew from a young age, like I wanted to have kids and I wanted to be able to afford to pay for their schooling and, all those sorts of things. And so I think, sometimes women, again, not to gender stereotype, but again, I've seen this a lot. They maybe have trouble advocating for themselves. And so one of the things T.D. Cole suggested in the book is think about it as you're advocating for your children or your grandchildren, how you want to create multi-generational wealth for your family to up level it. And so, or even like, hey, there's a principle here, like I need to be paid fairly, and, really go back to the data. And I have a bunch of tips and tactics in the book about how to negotiate and how to really keep it data oriented and what the different components of or of an offer negotiation look like. And I think it's important. Don't be shy about that. I remember sometimes several years ago, I had this woman who was loath to participate even in a search because she said to me, I don't have every box checked. I haven't done investor relations yet. And yet I kept hearing that she was such a phenomenal talent. And so I kept going back to her saying, please meet my client. I really think you'd be great at this job. And long story short, she ended up finally agreeing to meet the client. She got the job. She did phenomenally well. She's now in a Fortune 150 company on 2 public company boards. And I think about her because I think she didn't think she could do it. And she was sort of loath to participate because she didn't think she was ready. And yet she's viewed as a superstar. So if she has that inclination, chances are other people might as well. And so I think, again, it's really incumbent upon all of us who are managers to really encourage people to go for it, even if they don't check every single box. As you quoted earlier, Helen, nobody is the purple unicorn. Nobody checks every single box. There's no such, Amy said, I think position specifications are wish lists. And it's true. As a recruiter, I can tell you there's no such thing as a perfect candidate. So just have the confidence in yourself to know that you can do it.
That is very good advice. I do want to encourage, if there's anybody that has questions, feel free to drop them into the YouTube chat. But in the meantime, I am going to keep going. So so there's one concept that you talk about in the book that really struck me. And it's this concept of dual networks for women, which is slightly different for women, as you described it, relative to men. So I'd love it if you could sort of unpack what is this concept of a dual network, and more importantly, why it is so important for women to have a dual network.
Yeah. Well, I think, again, one of the things that we've found is that women tend to focus on the network within their company. And they're not getting, because again, this, again, historically speaking, a lot of times women are the ones going home. They're not the ones going out to a dinner that brings together industry leaders. They're not the ones going golfing on a Saturday morning. And as a result of that, their professional ecosystem can become a bit more myopic. And so I go back to some of the tips in the book around the networking component and really getting outside of your core to people who you don't know. And I think this is something that comes a bit more naturally for men. And women are always seemingly a bit more loath to do this. And, again, when you want things like a new job or you want data on what is that job worth? I always tell people, you should return the calls of really great recruiters who call you, even if you don't want the job, because they can be really helpful sources of information for you. I know that many people will get to a point in their career where their spouse, however well-intentioned, may not be able to give them advice. They can't talk to their friends about their compensation, certainly can't talk to your colleagues at work about thinking about taking another job. But recruiters kind of have this interesting, sort of proverbial rabbi or priest role in the career world where they can give information and can be helpful. So that can be one way of getting, building your dual network and getting outside of your basic construct. I remember years ago when LinkedIn was somewhat nascent, I remember getting a visual from them, and it showed all of my different networks and how people were connected. It was really fascinating. They don't do this anymore, I don't think, but really thinking expansively. And I always recommend, when people are job seeking, much as when, as a recruiter, I'm going to talk to 100 people before we hire one person for my client. Similarly, think about all the different vectors of your life and where you have connectivity. And don't be shy about asking for introductions to people. I think it will open you up exponentially to whether it's board opportunities, just information, and it will certainly give you a sense of freedom that you're not trapped if you feel like you are.
Yeah, that's such good advice, and definitely something that I've had to learn from being in a mindset of self-selecting out of a lot of the sort of opportunities to network and create connection, to really leaning into it. And again, it's reciprocal. So there's so much that you bring to every relationship as much as you receive. I think that's one good example of a potential pitfall that we can find ourselves falling into that can get in the way of our careers. Through your interviews, through your conversations, I'd love to hear if there are any other pitfalls or things that we may do inadvertently that may get in the way of advancing our careers in the way that we would like.
Well, what I'm hearing and seeing more and more is people who historically have maybe been a bit loath to ask for what they need. Like, for example, one of the women I interviewed in my book, when she was earlier in her career, when she had a young child, her CEO would always call a meeting from like 7:30 to 8:30 every morning. And she really wanted to drop her child off at school every day. And so it was like this huge stress every day because she was trying to get out the door and, get on the call and drop off her son and give him a hug goodbye. And I think now, I'd like to think, but I'm sure we could improve it, people are hopefully asking for what they need a little bit more. And again, because of technology and how we're all leveraging it, we know that we're all working 24/7. And I think if we have the trust in our teammates, we can say, hey, like let's have a group understanding that we're not going to schedule any team meetings between 7:30 and 9 in the morning, because many of us are dealing with children and getting out the door and all that sort of thing. And it may be different for different groups for what the issues du jour are. But I think you have to ask for that, because if you don't, you know people may just have blinders, right? I mean, again, going back to, everybody's sort of in their own world, and they may not understand what's going on for you. And if you don't share that, they can't potentially improve or accommodate it. And I think people are so willing and wanting to do that. I think the other thing that's particularly hard for high performers like you have at Google is this notion of like, you're always on a race. I mean, I know I felt it early. I'd skipped grades when I was younger, and I always felt like I had to be the youngest to achieve the most. And writing this book really was a great wake-up call for me, because I realized that life is long and we're all living longer, God willing. And so I think we should think about, I have people on my team today and they're awesome at what they do. And yet they might take an extra year or two to get to the next promotion cycle. And I'm okay with that. If they're working, 80% of my top performer, but still doing excellent work, because they're going to get there. And hopefully I'm going to retain them through all kinds of life's, ups and downs and issues. But I think there's something to just getting in an okay headspace with that internally, to say, you know what, I can't compare myself to anybody else's. I need to walk my own walk. And if it takes me 5 years to get to this level, and it only takes this other person 3 years, I've got to be okay with it, because I'm happy in my life and I'm not just solving for one equation, I'm solving simultaneous equations. And so I think, a mistake people would make is not having those conversations openly with leaders in their organization, because I think most people would be surprised that people would likely be pretty understanding.
Along those lines, when you look back at your career to date, especially knowing what you know now, do you have any sort of regrets about how you navigated, or things that you would have done slightly differently while still being sort of true to your authentic self? But just looking back, any reflections?
I can't say I regret anything, because I'm really happy with where I am, even though it wasn't a linear path. Um, but I think maybe not being apologetic for who I am. I mean, um, I think now that the reason that I am successful at what I do is that I'm memorable, and I think, pretty genuine and honest with people. And that resonates. Even if they're different from me, they appreciate my authenticity. And I
Very much.
do think, again, going back to a lot of the women I interviewed in my book, they were successful because of who they are, not despite who they are. And we have all the data to show that women have everything it takes to be just as successful as men, if not more so. And so just trusting in that. And, again, I go back to not doing things that you think other people will find attractive or, looking good on the top 10 list, but really doing things that resonate with who you are. And I'm really grateful I learned that. It took me maybe till I was 26 to learn that, but at least I learned it. And otherwise, I think, it's too easy for women, especially women who want to have children. There are going to be so many things that are thrown at you that if you don't have a real passion for what you do and you don't love what you do and you haven't discovered that, there are a lot of distractions. It's very easy to opt out. And I really believe that all of us have an obligation to, we're standing on the shoulders of some really groundbreaking women. And I'd like for us to continue that. Right now, it's going to take 132 years to get to financial parity between men and women. That, in my mind, it's far too long, and it's really shameful. Actually, there's no need for it. And I do think it starts with some self-reflection, saying, okay, what do I love, and how can I match that up against a career that can be meaningful and also, hopefully financially rewarding.
That is for sure. I'm sure there are lots of parents listening in right now. Do you have any advice for them as they're raising, future leaders, future female leaders, future male leaders, like what, or any gender that they identify with, like what advice do you have for them as they're raising children, as the world is shifting and the perceptions of leadership, as we talked about, how the traits have shifted over time? What should parents be telling their kids?
Yeah, well, I mean, anything is possible. I mean, I certainly grew up believing that, and I still believe it. But to the end of finding passion, I think it's really important that parents, obviously for boys and girls, expose your children to everything and make sure you're not being gendered in your approach. And again, I think having a passion, or as I just gave a talk, and one of the women I was presenting with called it her ninja skill. She's like, passion's too high a bar, but what am I like really uniquely good at? I think that's really important as a foundational element. And then, as I discussed, the financial implications of what you do, really drilling that financial independence into your children's heads. And I feel like financial planning should be something we should be talking to more young people about in a whole lot more detail, and maybe even teaching it in school. And then third, I would say choose an organization to join that has a history and a track record of supporting and promoting women. I know I was really fortunate, and I chose to join the San Francisco office of Russell Reynolds because when I interviewed there, I saw most of the leaders were women who had partners who also worked, and they had children. And I thought, wow, not that you have to see it to be it, but it sure does make things a lot easier. And then, I think finally, sponsorship is something that is really important. Once you get into that organization, don't just put your head down. I mean, it's important to put your head down, do your work, deliver great results, but make sure you are bringing people along in your journey who are invested in you, who want the best for you.
Such great advice, and such a wonderful way to end our conversation. I've really enjoyed talking with you. There's so many wonderful insights in the book and what you shared just now. Before we close out, is there anything else that we haven't touched on? Any themes from the book that you'd love to share before we wrap?
No, I mean, there's certainly more in the book. I hope everybody reads it. You can certainly follow me on LinkedIn as well. I publish a newsletter every Tuesday and addressing many of these topics that I'd love to see people commenting and engaging there as well. So thank you so much for hosting me. This has been a thrill, and I'm so honored, and look forward to staying in touch with everybody.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Jenna. It has been such a delight to have you here with us today. Thank you. Good luck with the book. As I said, I loved it. So I really do encourage everybody to go out and buy a copy and read it. There's so much insight and practical advice for everybody. And with that, I think we are going to wrap. So thank you so much, everybody. And thank you so much, Jenna, and have a wonderful day.